It has been a challenging time for U.S. President Donald Trump. His promise to repeal former President Barack Obama's health care policy, known as Obamacare, the moment he came into office, has fallen flat, with Republicans distancing themselves from what is now being called Trumpcare or even ObamacareLite. In the lead up to this failure, Trump's goal to enforce some sort of a Muslim ban, another one of his much celebrated campaign promises, has twice been rejected by U.S. courts. With the setbacks stacking up, where to now for President Trump's administration? We seek to answer that question in this edition of The Debate with me, Waqar Rizvi. Our guests for this debate are American author and former diplomat, Mr. Michael Springman, who is joining us live from Washington. And we're also joined by former U.S. diplomat, Mr. James Jatras, who is joining us also live from Washington. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Jatras, I'll start with you. Repealing Obamacare was Trump's, of course, major campaign promise. Why do you think he has failed to deliver?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. First off, in my opinion, he should not have started with Obamacare at all. I think he would have been better off starting with an infrastructure project where he would have gotten substantial Democratic support, I believe. I think tax reform would have been a better move. And the other problem with starting with Obamacare is that he seemed to have put too much faith in Speaker Ryan and the House Republican leadership that they could move this forward, and they did it, in my opinion, in a very ill-thought-out way, in particular not getting a consensus among the Republican members, particularly the House Freedom Caucus headed by Representative Mark Meadows. If they had done that, if they had done their homework and come up with, frankly, a much better bill than the one they had that many critics said really doesn't solve the problems of Obamacare, I think they might have done much better. I think Mr. Trump should have given, let's say, less of a blank check that Speaker Ryan knew what he was doing here, because clearly the Republican leadership did not know what they were doing.
Okay, Mr. Springman, how do you feel about that? Because as Mr. Jatras there says, many people are blaming Paul Ryan.
In this case, from what I can see, President Trump started out with a bad idea. He was going to tinker and modify Obamacare, which was another version of the failed Hillary Clinton care of some years earlier. Instead of proposing a realistic change in American health care to a single-payer system like other industrialized countries have in the world, he would have done much better, and he would have gone through and gotten his bill passed. But he tinkered with Obamacare, changing this, changing that, adding this, decreasing that, and it was basically nothing. And he created enemies where he didn't need to create enemies, which seems to be his pattern in practice in the 3 months that President Trump has been in office. If he had given a realistic situation and created it and gotten people on board with him, he could have gotten a realistic wonderful change in American health care. In 2012, for example, there were 45 million American citizens without health care or without sufficient health care. This comes from the Kaiser Foundation and from a contact at the AFL-CIO National Labor Union. Instead, Obamacare, the numbers keep changing every day, depending on who's talking, and it's nowhere near even half of what the situation was 5 years ago. We need decent health care, we need a single-payer system, and we don't need to tinker with a bad situation like Obamacare.
Okay, so Mr. Jatras, you know, Republicans have made a very big deal about their dislike for Obamacare, and they've done that consistently and a lot. Trump obviously made a very big deal of it during his campaign as well, and that may be partly why he won as well, because, you know, that was one of his main campaign promises. If this was so important to them, why didn't they take this more seriously?
Well, I think he did take it seriously. I think one of the, I'll say, problems that Mr. Trump has sometimes is that, like a businessman, he thinks in terms of, well, this is a really complex subject. Who really knows that well? I'll put that guy in charge. He's real smart. And, you know, that's what he does, for example, on national security. He appoints a bunch of generals to everything, which I think is also probably a mistake. But I think that's what he did here, that I think he took assurances from the House leadership that they knew what they were doing. And I don't think he should have invested that faith in them. By the way, I think some people even suspect an element of Machiavellianism here, that he needed to bring the House Republicans and particularly the Senate Republicans to heel, let them fall on their faces a couple of times, and let them know who's really supposed to be in charge in this town. Because I think the fear is that if he leaves them to their own devices, they'll just come up with the carbon copy plans they would have put forward for any Republican administration. Lots of tax cuts, lots of deregulation, nothing of the populist agenda that Mr. Trump ran on. For example, he wants to negotiate down the prices of pharmaceuticals with the power of the federal government. Well, that's anathema to the Republicans on Capitol Hill, free market and all that sort of thing. I think he needs to go back to his populist program and stop letting these regular Republicans, if you will, tell him what to do.
Okay, so Mr. Springman, do you think it's the populist program which will help Trump? Because we've already seen failures in other areas, haven't we, on the part of President Trump when it came to this, what many people would call a Muslim ban. It's twice been rejected by U.S. courts, several of them, in fact. And we've also had this talk of this Mexico wall. Mexico saying it's not going to pay for it. I mean, that policy does not seem to be doing as well as Trump possibly thought it would. What's behind all that? Is it the Republicans? Is it Trump who just needs to go at it alone?
In my opinion, President Trump has surrounded himself with people who have no concept of government, who have no experience in the real world of government, and who have no dealings with anything outside of the United States. This ban on 7 Muslim countries that he cut back to 6 Muslim countries after Iraq objected. These countries are all victims of American aggression. They've been destroyed by American foreign policy, by American warplanes, and by American soldiers, and by the Central Intelligence Agency. Trump has got to get rid of these people that are in his ear, like his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who apparently is a shill for Israel and Netanyahu. Well, we have nothing but confusion coming out of the White House with these 6 Muslim countries are deadly dangers, even though Saudi Arabia, which bankrolls a lot of the terrorism in the Middle East, is not affected by any of these bans. The Gulf states, which also bankroll this, and Qatar apparently had been printing Syrian passports to give out to terrorists invading Europe as part of this mass migration, they aren't on the ban, yet they are majority Muslim countries. Trump doesn't seem to know what he's doing, and he's been in office for 3 months now, and he'd better learn fast because he keeps making mistake after mistake after mistake, and in doing so, he gives his enemies, of which there are legion, more ammunition and more weapons to use against him and to either force him out of office or get him impeached. Problem is that the State Department doesn't seem to know what it's doing, and they have no ability that I've seen from my experience with them in selling foreign policy to the American government. They seem to be more concerned with dealing with foreign countries, not with the White House or Congress.
Mr. Jatras, how do you feel about that? Do you think it is genuine that Trump has surrounded himself by people who, again, as Mr. Springman said, do not have enough experience in governance? Because, for those of us outside of U.S. borders, this all makes for a very confusing scenario because we're all still trying to understand who President Trump really is.
Well, the reason it's confusing is for people outside the borders is because it's confusing for us here inside the borders, too. I agree with Mr. Springman as a fellow alumnus of the State Department that the department doesn't know what it's doing, and it's not just the Trump team. Look, there's a lot wrong with American foreign policy. There's a great deal of inertia, and it's very hard to turn the direction of American policy. I agree 100%. Why isn't Saudi Arabia on that list? Why aren't some of the Gulf states on that list? Why is Iran on that list? We haven't had one terrorist act, as far as I know, committed anywhere in America or in Europe by an Iranian or, for that matter, a Shiite Muslim. They've all been people who are purveyors of this Salafist ideology that connected with Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Now, Trump has been talking about his so-called Muslim ban to look for that as an ideological test to say we don't want people involved with the Muslim Brotherhood or some terrorist ideology entering the United States. I think that's a good approach. This list is a lousy list, but let's remember, this was Barack Obama's list. And when he acted on this list temporarily several years ago, the courts didn't say a thing to him. Now we have the Ninth Circuit, the worst circuit in the country, jumping in with judges trying to substitute their own point of view for what the Constitution and specific statutory authority allows the president to make a judgment of. And I think that's a much more fundamental degrading of our constitutional system, where a judge says, well, whether it's a good decision or bad, I'll be the judge, not you, when it's the president's legal authority that's at stake.
Mr. Springman, Mr. Jatros there makes a very good point, doesn't he? Because, you know, it would be easy to see this quote-unquote Muslim ban, the judgments against it, as a failure on Trump's part. But then, as Mr. Jatros there pointed out, this is sort of unfair, isn't it? Because Obama did something quite similar. Those 7 countries, in fact, were Obama's chosen countries. Why is the judiciary, if I may use that macro word, being unfair to Trump in this case?
Well, in this case, I think that, yes, indeed, these were Obama's countries. Obama had been deeply involved with something called the CARP program, the Comprehensive Analysis and Review and Revision of Program of essentially denying or delaying immigration benefits to Arabs and Muslims, simply because they are Arabs and Muslims. But what what President Trump has done was go beyond this. He has jumped into it with both feet, not looking to the left and not looking to the right, and said, oh, well, these are 6 countries. They are fountainheads of evil. We have to stop them. Well, in the past, in the United States, the few terrorist acts that have been committed here were done by American citizens born here or by naturalized American citizens. Visa holders, asylees, or whatever are way down on the list. So we have to look at the egregious examples of what President Trump has done, and in some cases, we have to bring in the courts, even the extremely liberal Ninth Circuit out west, to stop this, because Congress will not step in and take any action. And the administration has people that are either yes men or don't know what they're doing or what they're saying, and they simply go along with what President Trump has suggested in a tweet or what he thought about while he was shaving that morning. The problem is that the American government is confusing to itself, is confusing to the American people, and is, sure God, confusing to the rest of the world. And we've got to stop this. We've got to take Trump in hand and tell him that this is what you do and this is how you do it. We have a Constitution, we have a set of laws, and you have to abide by them. You are not above the law.
Okay, so Mr. Jatros, you know, I of course want to reply to what Mr. Springman there said, if you do have a response to that, Mr. Jatros, but I wanted to add this on, if I may. You know, America is a country that prides itself on allowing people in, being, you know, melting pot / mosaic, et cetera, et cetera. Many words are used for that. But this, especially since Trump became candidate and now president, for minorities, life has become tougher, hasn't it? Not just Muslims, of course, but Mexicans as well. And now we've heard about this African-American man who was killed in New York. You know, a white man had gone looking to kill black men, apparently. All of that creates a very negative society, doesn't it?
I think this is really badly characterized by our mainstream media. Look, if Iran, let's take a case as example, we're told you must be a melting pot, that the Farsi language, Shiite Islam, none of this should matter to you. Your national character and identity and values should not matter to you. You have an obligation to open your doors to the rest of the world without regard to religion, nationality, or anything else. We are the world, we are the children. What grounds do you have to object except you're a bunch of racists? You would not accept that. But somehow we as Americans are supposed to accept that. The Ninth Circuit has come close to saying that somehow the First Amendment and non-discrimination on the basis of race, religion, nationality, and so forth should apply to the entire rest of the world, and that somehow America no longer can be a country of English-speaking people, primarily of European background, primarily Christian, mostly Protestant, with our own tradition, history, and culture. Sure, we have lots of other people here, and we have a very tolerant society, and always have, to a greater or less extent. I mean, there have been some exceptions. But this notion that somehow we are obligated to abolish our national identity, our national values, because we are not a nation, we don't exist as a nation, is something I think helped propel Trump into the presidency. And I think that's also what we're seeing in European countries too, with Marine Le Pen and others in the populist movement saying, we're sick of this globalism, we're sick of this self-abolition and the danger being presented to our society by letting people in that we don't even know who they are.
Mr. Springman, do you have a response to that?
Well, and by and large, Mr. Jatras made a number of very good points. The thing is, though, that the problem is not so much internally, is the fact that the United States has no real border controls, and the United States tries to impose controls elsewhere in the world, blaming 6 Muslim countries for all the nastiness that can be possibly conceived of. The American government under President Trump has banned people from flying with anything bigger than a cell phone from the Middle East. I don't know how he can claim that he has great airport security and they x-ray everything and they have bomb-sniffing dogs and so forth all over the world. Yet at the same time, somehow these very same items are concealing horrendous weapons of mass destruction. I think we have to make priorities. I think we have to establish priorities. I think we have to look at the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, and we have to start making even-handed, sensible decisions based on facts, based on analysis, and not on whims of the moment and what the tweet is of the last 15 seconds.
Okay, Mr. Jatras, I'm glad Mr. Springman brought up that issue of the laptop/tablets ban in certain airlines and from certain airports flying into the U.S. That is, a lot of people find that very odd because there's certain details when you look into that. There are loopholes because there's certain airports within those very countries which will then you can fly to the U.S. With a laptop and tablet in hand. It's very specific airports, specific airlines. What's going on there? Why is that so confusing a policy, do you think?
I don't know, to tell the truth. And this is where you do get into a kind of a gray area. What is the factual basis for making these decisions? But I would turn Mr. Springman's observation around in a different direction. Yes, we must apply the laws. We must apply the Constitution. But who has the constitutional legal authority to make that decision? Not the courts. The president does. It's in statute that he has the authority to make those decisions, even if his factual basis might be questioned by somebody else. The law doesn't say, Mr. Judge or Miss Judge, you get to decide whether this is a good idea. The president gets to decide this is a good idea. It's his legal responsibility to try to protect our borders. And I agree, we've got a problem with our borders. But again, to turn this around, Mr. Springman is right. A lot of these countries have been the object of American interventions, military attacks, and so forth. You notice that the first ones to scream bloody murder about Trump's attempts to protect us inside our country have been the neoconservatives who say, oh, this is Islamophobic, it will alienate our wonderful allies like Saudi Arabia, yet these are the first people that turn around and want to go bomb and kill people in these other countries. Trump's view is to say, look, we want to protect our country. On the other hand, we don't want to engage in regime change, nation building, telling other countries how to live. I think there's more of a sense of, hey, this is what different countries are for. You live your lives in yours, we'll live our lives in ours, and we'll protect us here and mind our own business over there.
Okay, so Mr. Springman, what I'm getting the feeling of from Mr. Jatras, and I'm just paraphrasing him obviously, is that Trump's intentions are probably good in the sense that he's trying to protect the country when it comes specifically to this issue of borders and securing and figuring out who is coming in, pardon me. But I'm wondering, is that enough at this point? Because he does have a lot of obstacles, doesn't he? A, the Republicans, of course, and B, of course, then the Democrats.
Yes, he has that, and he's playing into their hands and playing into a gridlock in the city where nothing gets done, where no one trusts anybody else because of some remarkably ill-informed decisions. President Trump claims, as Mr. Jatras said, not to be interested in regime change, yet he sent commandos into central Yemen not long ago, killing people, and no one knows to this day how many civilians were killed by SEAL Team 6. He conducted 2 days of airstrikes against Yemen, 30 sorties, and still the government and the rest of the world doesn't know how many civilians were killed in that process. So yes, the president is out deeply involved in regime change, and that each of these actions, one upon the other, creates vast hatred of the United States, and instead of making the United States more secure, it makes the United States less secure, because President Trump continues the Obama policy, who continued the Bush policy, who continued the Clinton policy of war against the rest of the world, the forever war against Arabs and Muslims. We don't see this happening in Israel, for example. Israel is America's oldest enemy, blowing up U.S. Information Service offices in Egypt in the 1950s, attempting to sink the U.S. Navy ship Liberty, blinding a local girl who was an artist who was protesting the attack on the Mavi Marmora and the Palestinian flotilla. And it was the Israelis who murdered Rachel Corrie by driving over her twice with a 54-ton Caterpillar bulldozer. We don't look at this. We look at imaginary threats and imaginary hatreds from Muslims and Arabs. And in large part, if there is hatred of the United States by Arabs and Muslims, it comes directly from the end of an American gun. And we have to stop this. And if we want security, we have to make the rest of the world more secure instead of less secure.
Mr. Jastras, what are your thoughts on that?
A couple of things. Let's keep in mind, one reason that Trump's policy does look so far like Obama's policy is that 97% of his administration is still peopled either by career people or by Obama holdovers. He doesn't even have a deputy secretary over the Secretary of State yet. It is not really his team. And as I said earlier, I do have misgivings that a lot of the people he's put in place are simply military men whose answer is always the use of force. However, I don't agree that he is pursuing a regime change policy. What happened in Yemen was not directed against any government that I can think of. It was either Al-Qaeda or ISIS. I forget which one. And I think we are beginning to see a shift in Syria, where the American Chief of Staff met with his Russian and Turkish counterparts. We've seen evidence now around Manbij that the Russians and the Americans are beginning to get on the same page with the Kurds against Daesh implicitly, with the cooperation of the Syrian government. The Turks are not happy about this. The Israelis are not happy about this. That's why Mr. Netanyahu had to go flitting off to Moscow to try to get assurances about whether Hezbollah is going to end up on the Golan Heights. So I do think there is a shift in policy. I think it's beginning on the ground in Syria. We've seen some evidence of coordination between Russian and American hits on Nusra targets in Idlib. So I hope there's going to be a shift in the policy, but I'm afraid it's going to be agonizingly slow.
Unfortunately, it seems the clock has gotten the best of us, but of course we do appreciate both your contributions to this discussion. That was American author and former diplomat, Mr. Michael Springman, who was speaking to us live from Washington, and we were also joined by former U.S. diplomat, Mr. James Jastras, also speaking to us live from the U.S. Capitol. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.